In the last lecture today, traditionally, we bring in a guest lecturer to tell us about their perspective on complex systems, and it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Hal Abelson, who's a professor here and been here for many years, and some of you might have already taken classes from him. And what he's going to talk about is a topic we touched upon, but not in particular detail, in the first two lectures, and in particular the interaction of technology and complex systems with law and social issues.
Okay, thanks. Okay, hi. As Harry said, he asked me to talk about complex systems, which is kind of what you've been studying all semester. And today I want to give you a hint of another kind of complexity. So you've been doing the technical infrastructure for essentially what's become the information age. But the information age, you got to turn up the mic. But the information age has just changed the world immensely over the last 20 years, and it's run smack into another kind of complexity. And that's the complexity of how the stuff that we have all built as computer scientists and engineers has created these enormous stresses in the way people think about the legal structures and the regulatory structures, the way people deal with the world. And learning what you guys know can be a source of enormous power. But in order to use that, you have to understand that suddenly you're dealing with the real world. It's not just problem sets, or it's not just little theoretical issues about protocols or how authorization works. It's real impact on people's lives. And you run into people who think differently. In particular, you're going to have to learn to think about how lawmakers and the law and lots of other institutions deal with this. So this lecture, if you like, is partly a bit of an advertisement for 6805, which is a course I teach in the fall. And what 6805 really is about empowering you. What you have to understand is, by having taken the courses you've taken, like 6033, you now know more about the information architecture that makes the world work than all but the most minuscule part of humanity. And that can be a way to have impact, but only if you understand how that impacts the regulatory structure. So just to give you a tiny example, about 2 weeks ago, the MBTA put out for comments their new privacy policy, which was stimulated by the fact that the MBTA is planning on instituting a new fare system that uses RFID tokens. And one of the things that went into that policy is a whole bunch of criticism by a student project team in 6805 last fall, who worked with a state senator who was getting on the MBTA's case about not having adequate privacy regulations. So this bunch of MIT students essentially wrote the privacy regulations that are now being sent out to the public in the state of Massachusetts. That's a tiny, tiny example of the kind of thing that you are now prepared to do better than almost anybody else in the world. So what I'm going to talk about today is how these new architectures, the ones you've been studying, as you've already seen, right, what happens when you have a big complex architecture, you have to think about interactions and protocols and their standards and their enormous unintended consequences of things fitting together. So that's what you've been doing for lots of the semester, is understanding that. But today I want to talk a little bit how the same thing happens with the legal architecture. Same thing. There are protocols, there are standards, and there are enormous, enormous unintended consequences of people working on different parts of a complex system. Well, I'm not going to talk about privacy today. That is a thing that the fall course does. Today I want to talk about regulating speech. Okay, the kinds of things, speech, images, sounds, the way that society thinks about that, and the way, sort of the mess that the internet has created around that. So we can take like the simplest picture, right? So there's the internet, and there's a source someplace, and there's a destination someplace, and then there's this cloud, that's the internet, that they're communicating with, and that's the stupidest, simplest picture, right? You guys know infinitely more about this picture, just to unpeel the very first level of it. So you know that both the source and destination are probably connected to the net using an internet service provider. And of course, inside that cloud, there's all sorts of stuff, right? There's Cisco switches and hubs and phone companies and all sorts of things translating. You could fill out the complexity of that picture right now. But let's stay even at this simple one. Suppose something's happening there that, somebody doesn't like. Okay, somebody is downloading copyrighted information, copyrighted music or something, and the recording industry hates that. Somebody is sending threatening letters to somebody else. Somebody is doing gambling at a place where you're not supposed to gamble, something that somebody doesn't like. And let's think about we, society, would like to figure out how you can stop that or make it happen less by imposing regulation. And the question is, in any of these transactions, there are all sorts of places that you can impose regulation. Right? You can go to the source and you can say, hey, stop sending that pornography. Right? You could go to the destination and you'd say, hey, stop pulling down that copyrighted music. You could go to the ISPs, right? I'm sure nobody here has ever downloaded copyrighted music over the internet, but you can imagine the RIA going to MIT and saying, hey, MIT, you're the ISP for this connection. You put a stop to it. You could even imagine somebody going to the cloud, right? You can imagine Congress passing a regulation, or maybe you can't imagine it, but unfortunately, a lot of Congress can imagine passing a regulation that would say something like, hey, let's change those Cisco routers so that they won't pass along copyrighted information without permission. And everybody here, hopefully you're shrinking in horror because you know about things like the end-to-end principle, and you say, oh my God, that violates the end-to-end principle in a horrible, horrible way, but you don't think people in Congress know about the end-to-end principle. Right? They need people like you guys to explain it to them. That's the kind of thing that you can become empowered to do. So within that context, let's think about, controlling what people can say and how people can express themselves in words or music or images or whatever. Somebody comes down and says, hey, stop doing that. Right? Stop. You really shouldn't post that thing. It's bugging somebody to hell. And you say, oh no, because I've got freedom of speech. So let's look at freedom of speech. So where's freedom of speech come from in this country? Right, First Amendment, right? So this country has a First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law, right? Congress shall make no law, right? Respecting the establishment of religion or abridging the freedom of speech, ... So let's spend a little time thinking about that. What's it mean when it says Congress shall make no law? Okay, who's Congress? Right, Congress is Congress. Right, who else is restricted by the First Amendment? So like is the state of Massachusetts Congress? And the state of Massachusetts pass a law that says you may not post this certain kind of information. You may not post harassing information on the internet. Well, can they do it let me be more precise. Could they do it within the confines of the First Amendment? Right. Well, so we know that Congress is Congress, right? How about the state of Massachusetts? Are they Congress?
They're the same thing. They do everything else is Congress.
Well, it actually turns out the state of Massachusetts is Congress for the First Amendment. Question?
The Constitution is supposed to be like the supreme law of the land, so you can't do anything with the Constitution.
The Constitution is the law of the land. The Constitution says what it says. It says Congress can't do it. And the Supreme Court has interpreted Congress to mean the state of Massachusetts, except the city of Cambridge. The city of Cambridge passed a law that says you can't right, send this kind of things or utter these kinds of things. Okay, well, it turns out the city of Cambridge is too. It turns out the First Amendment covers most governmental things in the U.S. How about MIT? How about MIT? Could MIT, for example, have a rule that says that? Okay. Right? Can there be an MIT regulation that says that? How many people think there could be, and by could I mean without violating the Constitution? How many people think MIT could do that? How many people think MIT can't? Right? You go and you take them to court and you say it's unconstitutional. Okay. How about UMass Boston? Could UMass Boston have a regulation like that without violating the First Amendment? What do you think? How many people think it could? How many people think it couldn't? How many people have no idea? Yeah, well, sort of have no idea is the right answer, but it kind of turns out that this language actually comes exactly from a policy at University of Michigan 10 years ago, which was struck down by the court. So that was whatever we call these things, harassment policy or something. That was actually struck down by the court, and what the judge said is, look, this might be a good idea and we might like it, but in this country, government institutions like, by extension, the state of Michigan and the University of Michigan are constrained by the First Amendment. Okay. MIT's not. We can argue whether or not it's a good idea, but it's not unconstitutional for MIT to do that. Now, you might ask, do you guys have less solid guarantees of freedom of speech than students at UMass Boston? Well, yeah, probably. So there are lots of things that Congress, and by the extension of Congress, cannot prohibit. But what are some things that Congress can prohibit? What's some kinds of speech or images or things that you actually can have laws against? What do you think? You say, is there stuff that's, are there any limits to this at all? What do you think? Is there any kind of thing that you can have a law against?
The classic yelling fire in a private theater. Something that's clearly very dangerous.
Remember, this is about speech. This isn't about actions. Are there kinds of speech or images or things?
Like child pornography?
Child pornography, right? You can't actually possess child pornography in this country. We'll get back to that in a second. How about more?
Anything that can be defined as interstate commerce?
No, that just means you can't be regulated. I'm asking, what's a thing you're not? What's some examples of stuff you can't post on the internet?
Libel or slander? Libel or slander?
Yeah, there's a whole bit about there's a whole bit about copyright infringement we talk about. How about pornography? Right? You get in trouble for posting pornography on the internet. Is that prohibited by? Can that be prohibited under state law? Turns out it depends what you mean by pornography. In fact, if we sort of elevate up from pornography to what's normally called, pornography is bad, but like really bad. Right, so the word for really bad in U.S. law is obscenity. And it turns out, well, let's see if you know. Do you think there's a legal definition of obscenity, or is it like, hey, it's really bad stuff? How many think there's actually a formal legal definition of the court looks at something and says it's obscene? Okay, and how many think it's, it's like really bad stuff? Okay, so the first people are right. There actually is in this country a legal definition of obscenity, which was established in a case called Miller versus California in the 70s. And it said, this is the definition of obscenity according to the law. It's called the Miller test. And it says something is obscene if it satisfies all of the following three things. All three have to be true. The first one is that it depicts sexual activity in a patently offensive way. So like it's not an anatomy book. Okay. So that's sort of about what the stuff is. The second one is how people react to it, and it's a very interesting test. It says, would the average person applying contemporary community standards, right? Contemporary community standards, find that that appeals to the prurient interests. So it's sort of saying, well, it's not, the extreme guys who are really sensitive, and it's not the guys who just tolerate everything. It's the average person applying contemporary community standards. And then the third one is the thing, what people used to say, utterly devoid of any scientific, literary, artistic, or political value. That's sometimes called the SLAP test in law. So there is a thing called obscenity, and according to the law, the Supreme Court, actually in the Miller case, found it constitutional for there to be laws against transmitting obscene material in, somebody said it before, interstate commerce. So interstate commerce isn't prohibited, but it's the hook by which you can prohibit something. Okay. So it's 1994. It's 1994, and Robert and Carlene Thomas have a cute little family business in Milpitas, California. And what they do, they run a thing called the Amateur Action Bulletin Board System. So back before we had internet and ISPs, right? People had these bulletin boards you dial up. They ran the Amateur Action Bulletin Board System, and they distributed from that, well, stuff that you wouldn't show around in polite company. In fact, their logo was, "We are the nastiest place on earth," 1994. Well, 2 years ago, 1992, they got raided by the Milpitas police, who said, "God, you got all this smut around, we're going to close you down." They protested. The police looked at it and they said, "Well, it's bad stuff, but it's not obscene by the standards of Milpitas, California. We'll leave you alone." Now we're back in 1994. There's a knock on the door, and in come the Milpitas police, accompanied by the U.S. postal inspectors. And Robert and Carlene are accused of using a means of transmitting obscene material using a means of interstate communication, namely a computer and a modem and a phone line, to transmit obscene materials interstate. And they're accused of transmitting them interstate to David Diermeyer. Who's David Diermeyer? They don't know who this guy is. Turns out that David Diermeyer is a postal inspector in Memphis, Tennessee. And he gets a complaint from somebody in western Tennessee saying, "Hey, there's this awful smut on the internet. Can't the U.S. Postal Authority do anything about it?" So he takes his computer, dials up, right? "Welcome to Amateur Action Bulletin Board, the nastiest place on earth. And here's some titillating little pieces of stuff that you can get from us. But if you really want the good stuff, send in $55, register, and join." So he sends in his phone number and his address and an assumed name with his $55. A couple of days later, he gets a call from Robert Thomas saying, "Hi, thanks for your $55. Here's your password. Go to town, have fun. Welcome to the nastiest place on earth." So he downloads some stuff and then files a complaint against him because of this transmission of this material interstate from Milpitas, California to Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, so police come, they arrest the Thomases, they They impound all their stuff, and they go on trial before a jury in Memphis, Tennessee, which convicts them of transmitting material that is obscene by the community standards of Memphis, Tennessee, which are different from the community standards of Milpitas, California. Okay, so what do you think of that? What do you think? Is that okay? Okay. What? You think she go by their community, right? Whose standards should it follow? Is this Tennessee? Is this, what do you think? Right, so that's the question. If you go and commit an atrocity in another country, right, is Thomas in Tennessee or is he in California? That's the question. He appeals. They appeal their conviction and they lose. And the judge basically says, well, I don't quite want to decide this, but notice, dum-dum, that you had the guy's phone number so you knew where he was when you called him, so you should have been aware that this stuff was going to Memphis, Tennessee. Right? 3 years in jail under that. You might want to compare that. Let's move away from pornography or obscenity for a minute. Here's another thing that's illegal. It is illegal to traffic in that stuff. Right? It is illegal to traffic in that stuff. That's Hitler's birthday commemorative stamp. In France. It's okay in the US, but in France, it is illegal to traffic in Nazi memorabilia. And in 2000, some folks in France, right, this is on the Yahoo auction, which actually this page isn't up anymore. Some people in France filed a lawsuit against Yahoo for allowing people in France to connect to Yahoo in the US and order Nazi memorabilia. And that case, you might want to compare that with the amateur action case. But that case is still going on. It's gone back and forth. It's wildly complicated because it involves international law and French courts and U.S. courts. It's still going on since 2000. There's an article that came out, 2 weeks ago that talks about this case being argued in front of the Ninth Circuit in California. Enormously, enormously complex stuff, right? Because the internet, what's this stuff mean in a world where distance is meaningless, right? I mean, you guys know there are McDonald's in Missouri where you drive up to this window and you put in your order and there's a camera and you say what your order is. And then you drive around and you pick up your stuff at the kitchen. There are McDonald's in Missouri where that transaction from you ordering it goes to a McDonald's call center in Colorado, which pieces the thing together, sends it back to the kitchen, right? Sends it back to the kitchen at the McDonald's you're at in Missouri, and by the time you drive around the McDonald's to pick this thing up, your order's ready. And because this call center in Colorado does a whole bunch of them and has people who are trained, it is cheaper for McDonald's and faster to route this transaction from Missouri to Colorado in the time you're driving around the building than it would be if they ran the thing through the kitchen. You have to ask, in a world like that, that's the world that we're all making with the internet. And what do these laws mean? So that's a little bit about obscenity and contemporary standards. In 1995, most people in this country were barely aware that there was an internet. And the way most people in the country learned in 1995 that there was a thing called the internet was this way. That's Time magazine from July 1995. Right? You guys think it's funny, right? Right? Time magazine teaching people about the internet. Right? Sex is everywhere these days. In books, magazines, films, televisions, music videos, and bus stop perfume ads. Americans have become so inured to the open display of eroticism and the arguments for why it enjoys special status under the First Amendment that they hardly notice it's there. But something about the combination of sex and computers seems to make otherwise worldly-wide adults a little crazy. And if you think things are crazy now, still quoting from the article in 1995, wait until the politicians get hold of a report coming out this week. A research team at Carnegie Mellon University has conducted an exhaustive study of online porn. Right? Who's downloading it? What turns them on? And feelings are sure to pour out. And lo and behold, published is a study about online porn, where they carefully studied the habits of average Americans, who I think were CMU undergraduates, using Usenet, and they found out interesting conclusions. One is they found out that Robert and Thomas were actually doing really well. They were pulling in over $1 million a year in their business out of Milpitas. And the other is 83.5% of all images posted on Usenet are pornographic. Right? June 26, 1995, Senator Charles Grassley, who's still in the Senate, right up on the floor of the Senate. Mr. President, there is an article from Time magazine and an article that I ask unanimous consent to have printed in the congressional record. Mr. President, this morning I want to speak on a topic that has received a lot of attention around here lately. My topic is cyber porn. Mr. President, Georgetown University has released a remarkable study conducted by researchers of Carnegie Mellon University. The study raises important questions about the availability and the nature of cyber porn. The university surveyed 900,000 computer images. Of these 900,000, 83.5% of all computerized photographs available on the internet are pornographic. I want to repeat that, 83.5%. These are all on the internet and are pornographic according to the Carnegie Mellon study. I believe Congress must act and do so in a constitutional manner to help parents who are under assault this day and age. There's a flood of vile pornography, and we must act now to stem the growing tide. And indeed, Congress acted and passed a law called the Communications Decency Act, which basically said that anybody who, you want to look at the words of this, they're quite important, who makes available to someone under the age of 18 years things that are patently offensive, measured by contemporary community standards, ... or knowingly allows a telecommunications facility to be used for that purpose shall be fined under Title 18 or imprisoned for not more than 2 years. Okay? This is called the display provision of the Communications Decency Act, passed into law the beginning of 1996. Okay? And notice what it's doing in terms of our picture. It's saying there's bad stuff going on. Who can get hammered? Right? The person sending it? The ISP who knowingly makes that stuff available? Cisco, who's building the routers? Maybe. This became part of U.S. law. They also added another thing that's kind of interesting. They added a thing called the Good Samaritan provision of the Act, which says nobody who's an ISP, right, and that was to help these poor guys who are feeling very nervous. Nobody who's an ISP shall be treated as the publisher of bad stuff if the information came from somewhere else, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, why'd they add that? Well, it's 1990, and there's a bulletin board system called CompuServe. Is CompuServe still around? Anybody know? What by AOL? Okay, so CompuServe is one of the early ones. And CompuServe had a bunch of B-boards. And they had a thing called Rumorville, where someone was using CompuServe to post a thing called Rumorville, which was part of their journalism forum. So another guy named Robert Blanchard starts up another online publication called Scuttlebutt. And it was designed to compete with Rumorville. Rumorville then starts publishing defamatory statements about Blanchard and Scuttlebutt, right? The whole thing's a scam. They're no good. They rip off their stories by copying them from Rumorville and ... And Blanchard goes and sues CompuServe. Okay? You guys are letting this stuff happen. It's hurting my business. It's hurting my stuff. Now, what's he suing them for? He's suing them under a law called defamation. So another little piece of law. This is another thing that you can get in trouble for. Defamation is something that, again, all three things, is false, you communicate to somebody else, and causes damage. It's defamation law. And there are two kinds of defamation. There's the stuff that you say, which is slander, and the stuff that you write, that's libel. So Blanchard goes and sues CompuServe for defamation. And in one of the basic first rulings on internet defamation law, Cubby versus CompuServe, the judge basically says tough. CompuServe, they're just like a bookstore, and they got some books there, and they don't really know what's in those books. You can't really hammer them for what's in their books. They neither knew nor had any reason to know what was in that stuff. Go sue the guys go sue Rumorville, but CompuServe's off the hook. Okay, so in terms of our picture of regulation, the court is saying for defamation, it's that. Why is it? Say again, sir.
Oh, why did we not consider the defamation like people?
Who are getting? Well, there's some poor innocent people. You, right? You're sitting there. You're logged into CompuServe. You read some awful thing about Rumorville. She's supposed to get hammered for that? Yeah, this is other people who are just sort of knowing it. The source is coming from there. Okay. That was 1990. It's 5 years later. 5 years later, the internet is growing. There's concern about pornography. It's not only the uber geeks who are using CompuServe. There's a company called Prodigy. Prodigy still exists, right? So Prodigy was a bulletin board. They advertised themselves as a family-friendly service. Hi, guys, there's this internet, and you can join up Prodigy. It's kind of safe for your kids. And the way they did that is they had chat rooms, and they hired people to moderate their chat rooms. And if any bad stuff happened, the moderator would cut it off. Okay. So Prodigy's running the family-oriented B-board service. And there's a company that's an investment banking place called Stratton Oakmont. And they're about to make a new offering, and somebody on one of the Prodigy bulletin boards starts publishing stuff about Stratton Oakmont. They don't know who this somebody is. It's anonymous. But Stratton Oakmont's a bunch of crooks. The president was in jail. This offering they're going to do is a fraud. And Stratton Oakmont goes and sues Prodigy. Right? Because whoever's posting it was anonymous. They go sue Prodigy. And Prodigy says, hey guys, we went through this. This is Cubby v. CompuServe all over again. Go find the people who are doing it, get on their backs, we're clean. And the New York Court of Appeals, New York State Court of Appeals says, you're not the same because you are moderating those chat rooms. You are taking responsibility for what is being said there, and therefore you have liability, right? Because you are doing the moderation. You, in fact, are liable as the publisher of that stuff because you're controlling it.
Speech allowing ISPs to get off the hook.
So it's quite comforting for freedom of speech to let ISPs to get off the hook. So in response to this, every university lawyer at any place that had an internet went to the administration and said, hey guys, don't control what the students are doing. Right? Whatever you do, don't control it. Because as soon as you do, you are liable. Okay, it certainly happened at MIT, and I assume every place else. Right? But what's it doing in terms of our picture here? Okay? So our poor ISPs who were off the hook now get targeted in a way big time. So coming back to the Communications Decency Act, right? Why was there that Good Samaritan position? That Good Samaritan provision? Well, Congress was sitting there and they were saying, well, gee, not only do we want to regulate pornography and stop that, but we really would like the ISPs to help us, you know. We'd like them to filter this stuff out. So it's the policy, and this is part of the law, it's the policy of the U.S. that there should be filtering available, and we want to encourage, you know, parents and ISPs and everybody to keep this smut off the network. On the other hand, that was right after the Prodigy decision. And all the ISPs said, well, hey, wait a minute. That's not going to work. So they passed this Good Samaritan provision, which was trying to let them get off the hook. And it's actually a little bit more complicated than that because this had to do with the Republicans and the Democrats and stuff that got worked out in committee and different bills of which pieces were taken from other bills and put together. Winston Churchill once said that anyone who likes sausages or law should never watch either of them being made. And the Communications Decency Act is a little bit like that. Well, the law got passed in February 1996. The whole civil liberties world went nuts. Everybody who was looking at internet law went nuts. If you take 6805, there's a long story about what eventually turned out to be a major decision in First Amendment law, which I won't go into here. But the net result is the Supreme Court decided that the display provision of the Communications Decency Act was unconstitutional. Right. Oh, let me go back for a second. Right, and they said, you know, why? Well, the community standards are too broad. It means that if you apply that, that means the standard of the most restrictive community will start applying across the whole country, and provision of First Amendment law. Turns out the government can pass laws to protect kids' access to stuff. But they said, gee, in this case, by this desire to protect kids, you're restricting adults from what they should be able to get. Anyway, a long, very, very important First Amendment decision, Reno versus ACLU. So the Supreme Court ruling came down, and everybody was happy. Civil liberties were groups, and everybody jumped up and down and said the internet is a zone of free speech. Which brings us to Ken. So it is we're back in 1995. It's April 19th, 1995. So we just went through the 10th anniversary of a really horrible thing in U.S. history. Anybody know what it is? Almost exactly 10 years ago? The bombing of the courthouse in Oklahoma City, April 19th, 1995. Okay, so I guess you guys remember that. So about a week later, appears on AOL an announcement that says, hey, Naughty Oklahoma t-shirts. Visit Oklahoma. It's a blast. And lots of cruder things about referring to the kids who'd been killed in that bombing and all sorts of stuff. All right, visit Oklahoma. It's a blast. Call Ken for Naughty Oklahoma t-shirts. And there in the message is the phone number of Ken Zarin, who's like just a guy who lives in Seattle. Well, lots of people call Ken, right? They call him angry and upset with obscene phone calls, threatening phone calls. And so, you know, he says he doesn't know anything about this. They said, what the hell are you doing? They tell him about this thing he did, right? How could you possibly do that, you bastard? So he calls AOL. And he says to AOL, come on, you know, I didn't put this up. It's got this stuff that says it's got my name on it. Take it down and publish a retraction. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Zarin. You know, we sort of have to look into this, and you have to understand that we don't actually know who had this account because they're anonymous, and it's not our policy to publish retractions, but, you know, we'll sort of do it, and maybe we'll turn off the account, we'll go check into it. Next day. More slogans. Naughty Oklahoma. We got T-shirts. We got bumper stickers. Visit Oklahoma. It's a blast. Call Ken. And by the way, there's a real demand for these things. So if you call and the line's busy, make sure you call back. Okay? By April 30th, Ken Zarin's getting an abusive phone call every 2 minutes. Okay? May 1st, KXRA, a local Oklahoma radio station, says, you know what's going on in Seattle? There's this guy who's publishing stuff, selling T-shirts, making fun of our kids who died in the blast 2 weeks ago. His name's Ken Zarin. Why don't you tell him what you think about him? Here's his phone number. Here's his address. Right? The police are guarding Zarin's house now. Well, Zarin finally gets in touch with KXRA, and they publish the announcement that it's a mistake. They broadcast a retraction of that. You know, and by the end of May, Zarin's down to only 15 threatening phone calls a day. Okay, so over the next months, he gets a lawyer, and he sues AOL. He says, you guys are negligent. I called you about this thing. It was causing me harm. It was on your thing. You did not take action. It took a real long time for them to shut off these accounts. And you guys are guilty of negligence. And AOL's lawyers go, hey. The Supreme Court, well, the law hadn't been struck down by then. They go, hey, look at this provision that Congress has passed into law. I don't care what you said we did. We didn't provide that information. We have no liability for it. And the court agrees with them. And it turns out, by the way, that when Congress struck down the Communications Decency Act, they struck down that display provision. But there's nothing unconstitutional about that. You can argue whether or not it's a good idea, but there's nothing unconstitutional about it. This thing is still part of U.S. law. You had a question. What was it struck down?
Well, what was the lawsuit?
The lawsuit was actually at the beginning of '96. It sort of went through this whole thing. Took him, I think it was the beginning of 1996, because there was a lot of arguing and harassment and going back and forth with AOL between when it was done. It took several months. Okay, so AOL said, I don't care if we're negligent. We're free. Not our problem. Gets worse. 2001, Jane Doe, in an anonymous lawsuit, sues AOL on behalf of her teenage son, John Doe. Right? It's anonymous. They're protecting him because he's a minor. And she's suing AOL. She lives in Florida. Turns out there was a guy named Richard Russell, who by that time was in prison, as you'll see for obvious reasons. Advertised on AOL to find kids who would come to his house. And he filmed them in pornographic acts, right, including Jane Doe's son, John Doe, and sold this stuff over the internet on AOL. So Jane Doe sues AOL. You guys are making money from trafficking in child pornography, in pornographic pictures of my son. Right? Now we're talking child pornography. AOL says, hey, the Good Samaritan provision, Title 18, Section 230, we're not liable. Right? This is 2001, and this bounced around in the courts for about 3 years, finally went to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court agreed with AOL. It ain't the greatest thing, man, but that's what the law says. You are not liable as an ISP if you're not the provider of that information. So that's a 2-to-1. That's a 2-to-1 decision in the Florida Supreme Court. The minority opinion by Judge Lewis, the guy just went ape. He said, "This is nuts." Right? It can't. How could it conceivably have been the intent of Congress in a law that was motivated by protecting kids from pornography on the internet? How could it conceivably been the intent of Congress that a consequence of that law is now that somebody who's trafficking in child pornography is actually immunized? Okay, but that's the current state of the world. And you see what it comes from. It comes from looking at this very complex system of regulations and the interaction between First Amendment law and defamation law, and the fact that you can apply regulations, right? You want to partly immunize those ISPs, right? But you don't want to let them off free, and you end up with exactly the same kinds of unintended consequences that happen whenever you monkey with any complex system. It's not a whole lot different from the kind of stuff you've seen on the technology side when you're talking about how the technical base of the internet works. So where's that leave us? Well, I guess in terms of the law, it kind of leaves us there in a very, very confused state, and getting more and more confused because what's happened recently, this whole thing is now mixed in international law. Right? If you go search on Google for the stuff from the Taiwan Ministry of Defense, you'll find that in the U.S. Will you find it in China? No. Google China has a different search. Will you find it if you somehow are able to log into U.S. Google from Beijing? Yeah, you'd see it. What kind of liability is there? Is that your personal liability with the Chinese government? Is it Google who's going to get hammered in their trade agreements terms with China? We don't know. What's going to happen with France and Yahoo? Right? So this whole picture has become even much more complex as a consequence of all of us engineers making this internet, which has effectively made distance vanish. So where's that leave us? It leaves us with you, I guess, and where I started. You guys have enormous power that comes from the stuff you've learned in this course. You have the ability to go out and really influence the world by making stuff, by explaining, right? By explaining to people stuff they don't know, like the end-to-end principles one, right? And it's really a question of, would you like to grab that power and take advantage of it? But in order to do that, you need to understand this other piece of the world. Okay, thank you.